This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, we return now to our in-depth look in this Democracy Now! Exclusive at the strange case of Frederick Bourke, who blew the whistle on a foreign bribery scam in the former Soviet Republic of Azerbaijan that robbed many investors in the U.S. and abroad of hundreds of millions of dollars, but he ended up being the only one going to prison in the United States. We recently sat down with two of the most knowledgeable people on the case, journalist Scott Armstrong and attorney Michael Tigar, who is representing Rick Bourke. I asked Scott Armstrong to talk about the geopolitical importance of Azerbaijan to the United States.
The problem that Bourke faced as a whistleblower was that he was blowing the whistle against somebody who was beyond, essentially enjoyed impunity. That is to say, he was blowing the whistle about the government of Azerbaijan, about the president, Geydar Aliyev, and his son, Ilham Aliyev, who was running the state oil company at the time. And Azerbaijan was absolutely critical to U.S. interests. First of all, it was the source of these enormous oil riches in the Caspian Sea. Secondly, the only route out of the Caspian Sea for not only Azerbaijani oil, but also for the oil of other former Soviet states in that region is through Azerbaijan or Iran. And clearly we weren't going to encourage, given our relations with Iran, even back at that point, going in that direction. In addition to that, after 9/11, the government of Azerbaijan, headed by Geydar Aliyev, was enthusiastic about the U.S. participation in a war against terror, and was one of the few Islamic countries to endorse it. So it was a critical ally in that respect. And lastly, it was because it's located in the Caspian Sea, which is essentially the upper back door, if you will, to Iran, as well as looking across at Russia, it became an incredibly important location for U.S. intelligence facilities, over-the-horizon radars. When I was there in Baku later in 2007, the largest contingent of U.S. Marines anywhere in the world stationed permanently was in Azerbaijan, and nobody really knew it at the time. So this was a relationship that the United States government felt it could not lose. So Bourke, when he was pushing the United States government and others to do something about it, was facing an enormous uphill battle. Plus, the other investors were not pleased. They were interested to learn that Khomeini had stolen their money, but they were then trying to get it back and negotiate it, and they didn't want Khomeini indicted, and they didn't want the complications of other investigations. But Bourke forged ahead and gave his testimony directly to the New York State's attorney, and was fully cooperative, and he met with the federal government repeatedly and gave them all the information that he had, waived his attorney-client privilege, did things that most citizens would never be advised to do, did it in a forthright manner. Now, I'm not defending his reasons for getting involved in the investment in the first place. That was clearly to make some money, but he did it when he realized it was that it was a corrupt deal. He came forward and continued to come forward and never relented.
I want to ask you about Rick Bourke going to the president of Azerbaijan to expose, this is what he did first, what he had learned. It might astound many people to know this. But Scott Armstrong, if you could talk about what he did.
When Bourke found out that there was something wrong, that he read a World Bank report, and he realized from the statistics that the Azeri government had reported there that Khomeini had to be involved in a fraud, he started going to other investors and got a lawyer for Omega to work with him, and they went around doing some final due diligence after beginning to realize that their investment had been embezzled and lost. And in the process of it, the allegation was that Khomeini had been working with the son of the president of Azerbaijan. The son's name was Ilham Aliyev, and who is now the current president. The then president, Ilham's father, Gaidar Aliyev, was approached through the good offices of George Mitchell to get an appointment, and they got in to see him, and they went in and said, "You realize there's gambling going on in your casino." I mean, it was a scene out of Casablanca. And he feigned, "Oh, I'm shocked that anybody would suggest this. I'm shocked that Khomeini, who everybody knows Khomeini's a crook, I wouldn't be involved with Khomeini. I wouldn't let anybody anywhere near Khomeini." Well, of course, by that point, Khomeini and Gaidar Aliyev's son Ilham were effectively partners in all this. So it was a virtually comical scene that partially testifies to Bourke's naivete in thinking that just by blowing the whistle, the walls would come tumbling down.
One of the reasons, Scott Armstrong, you were so interested in this, because it was, it's like reading a John le Carré novel, but, which it's a sad story because one person ends up in jail here. But to understand what happened in Azerbaijan and all of the interests there, the largest marine base in the Caspian Sea, so the U.S. has a tremendous interest there. The World Bank gets implicated, universities get implicated, large corporations get implicated. But could you talk about the original, the reason Khomeini had this money to go to Azerbaijan, starting in the Czech Republic, to understand this whole privatization scheme across Eastern Europe?
One of the policies of the United States government after the fall of the Soviet Union was to suggest a series of privatization measures so that in a socialized society that had been under a communist rule, where the state owned most of the major assets, they would essentially take the value of the entire set of assets, the public part of the state, divide it by the number of people, and issue what amounted to vouchers or shares in that. And then those vouchers could be traded, combined in different ways, and citizens would therefore participate in the privatization, in the turn of their from a closed communist society to a market society. They'd be able to participate in that process and get back some of the value that was owned by the state. It's never really worked that way. It's never really worked well. It's been corrupted repeatedly. One of the worst cases was Czechoslovakia, where Khomeini was the principal exploiter. This was what I think interested the New York State attorney when Bourke came forward. They began to see how serious a set of international crimes this implied, that this was a kind of systemic theft that could take place anywhere, and it was a poster child for that proposition that they could go after. Even today, the Czech Republic is still investigating. Lots of new information's come out. Hopefully this story is not over, but the United States government has never cooperated with the Czech investigation. They've instead frustrated it. They refused to provide documents. They refused to provide materials that were available. It's only the New York State's attorney that's cooperated. So when we talk about public epistemology and how we get to know things, this is a very frustrating story. A whistleblower comes forward. It's very productive, leads to, the string begins to get pulled, and it leads to a whole international series of transactions going from Czechoslovakia, Azerbaijan, going into the heart of Russia, into the largest of institutions, and it all gets brought to ground by the lack of interest for the United States government for reasons that are opaque. And the only person who sacrifices in this is the whistleblower.
Let's talk about who some of those investors were. Rick Bourke alone did not invest in privatizing the Azerbaijan oil supply. In fact, you have Columbia University, you have AIG, you have a mega fund. Who else, Michael Tigar? Talk about who this group of investors were that lost a fortune.
Well, the interesting thing that list, if I had to recall it from memory, since I didn't know that this would be a multiple choice exam today, would be long. But the interesting thing about Columbia University is, and this is one of the things, Judge Scheindlin is a good judge, yes.
This is the Columbia University investment.
Columbia University invested in the Khomeini's project.
$10 million.
$10 million. They would not have done so if this deal stunk. That is to say, they did their due diligence. They didn't think there was any bribery. They didn't think there was anything wrong. And yet the testimony of those folks was excluded at trial, even though it would have shown that, you know, how could you know? Once you demonstrated that Bodmer's testimony was suspect, how could Rick have been in a position to have the culpable knowledge?
Let's talk about another investor, George Mitchell, the former Senate Majority Leader.
Bourke actually talked to Mitchell about this investment. Mitchell had met with Khashoggi, and again, he invested in that spring of 1998 time. And eyes wide open. Everybody knows who Senator George Mitchell is. Senator George Mitchell is not somebody who is looking to be corrupt, who's looking to be involved in corruption. He was looking to get an investment that he thought was reasonable under the circumstances. And throughout this process, he has been helpful. That is, he understands that the evidence that Rick Bourke was culpably knowledgeable about bribery simply doesn't wash.
You know, I want to ask a question about what happened to these other investors and why they weren't making as much a deal of their millions of dollars in losses as Rick Bourke was. Now, he hadn't invested as much as most of them had. And yet, why this hasn't been made public by some of them. Now, Columbia loses $10 million. Maybe they don't want to make it public. This is money for the endowment. But this leaves Rick Bourke out there alone.
Yes, it does. I am disappointed in the other investors. Let me start with that. But, you know, I've been in law practice a long time. And if you are the victim of a colossal fraud that involves not just your lunch money, but the money of other people who have reposed confidence in you and are putting their money with you. You know, if you can start a lawsuit, preferably some distant place where they speak some other version of the English language called London, and in an arbitral tribunal or in a court or whatever, and get some of the money back, that's really all you want, because he who chases justice may catch it.
So you might want Rick Bourke to be shut up. Because
and indeed, when he went to these other investors, they were perfectly happy to say, well, maybe we could file a little lawsuit here, a little lawsuit there, and so on. But if one of these days you will meet Rick Bourke and realize that that's not his style. He stood up and he went to the prosecutors. That's just not the style of people in the investment community.
We're talking about people like Leon Cooperman, very influential hedge fund manager, former Goldman Sachs executive who runs Omega Capital Partners, which was one of the organizations that invested.
Biggest investor.
Yes. You know, when is the last time that a major investment firm started running around the streets claiming that they'd been defrauded and wanted to make a big deal out of it, as opposed to going someplace to see if they could get some of the money back? I don't know.
Let me put that question to Scott Armstrong. Scott Armstrong, what about Leon Cooperman, head of Omega, a major investor?
Well, in the beginning, when Bourke began blowing the whistle, Cooperman his lawyers told Bourke that he could not use some of the information because when Bourke had gathered it, he'd gathered it with some help from one of the Omega lawyers, one of the hedge fund lawyers. But also, Bourke was facing AIG, one of the other major investors, which wanted both Cooperman and the principals in AIG wanted to settle this as quietly as they could. And when they couldn't do that, they wanted to go to the London courts and see if they could pursue it there. But they did not want to do this in the United States. They did not want this to become a subject of a criminal investigation by the New York district attorney or by the federal government. They wanted to keep it on the quiet.
Interestingly, the judge in this case was Judge Shira Scheindlin, who's also had the recent historic decision in the racial profiling case. And in her sentencing of Rick Bourke, she said, after years of supervising this case, it's still not entirely clear to me whether Mr. Bourke was a victim or a crook or a little bit of both. And she actually sentenced him to a lighter sentence than the prosecutors were calling for. Could you talk about the the main reasons why you believe that the government's case was defective and why the Rick Bourke should not have been convicted?
Well, the principal testimony that suggested that Bourke knew about the bribery was that of Hans Bodmer, this German-Swiss lawyer from Zurich. And he said that on February the 6th, 1998, at the Hyatt Hotel in Baku, he had received authorization from Kozani to tell Bourke that Bourke, who was then accompanied by a man named Evans, and Bodmer took a walk, that Bodmer explained the whole thing and that they turned right and left and the weather was this or that. The prosecutors had laid great stress on this meeting having happened in February because Bourke didn't invest till March. Turned out that flight records showed indisputably that Bourke wasn't in Baku in February.
In Azerbaijan.
In Azerbaijan, which is Baku's the capital city. Not only was he not there.
On that day, right?
On that day.
Right.
Nor at any other time when Kozani, Evans, and Bourke could have been together in that way. Not only that, but if you look at the history of Bodmer's proffers with the government, their notes of the meetings, he started out telling a different story. Not until he came to the February story did they offer him his plea bargain, which resulted in him getting no jail time.
And the significance of what he said meeting with Bourke at that time in Baku was that he says that he explained to him they were bribing foreign officials.
That's right. This is what we are doing. Farrell also testified that he had said something to Bourke. Farrell's background and history, much of that information remains under seal. And you, as journalists, have more access to it and can talk about it more freely than I can. But the fact is that both Bodmer and Farrell got bargains that resulted in them serving no time in United States prisons. Farrell permitted to go back to Russia. And that...
Farrell is an American who runs a bar in Russia in St. Petersburg.
Tom Farrell it was Kozani's money man. He was the bag man. That's what he said.
Does he work for U.S. intelligence?
I believe that he works for, I believe that Farrell has connections to intelligence communities. And I'm being deliberately guarded about this because there's a whole sealed record that I, as a member of the bar and as a lawyer, am not permitted to talk about. And that Judge Scheindlin eventually held that the defense was not entitled to cross-examine about.
Why would it matter?
Why would it matter? Because the question here is, why is it that the United States government, having seen that the district attorney's office has caught Kozani a thief, why is it that they would go after the guy that blew the whistle on the thievery and bribery, Rick Bourke? Why is it that the Czech citizen and the guy, the ex-patriot, and the German-Swiss lawyer all are walking free? The American citizen, philanthropist, and so on, is sitting in a minimum security jail. Well, investment in the Azerbaijan hydrocarbon industry is now safely in the hands of major petroleum companies. Is that a reason? Or is it that this money launderer in Zurich and Farrell sitting happily with his expat haven bar in St. Petersburg are people that the government chose instead to protect?
That was Michael Tigar, attorney representing Frederick Bourke, the whistleblower who went to the U.S. Department of Justice to expose an international criminal enterprise involving massive bribes paid to officials of the government of Azerbaijan aimed at gaining control of the state-owned oil company. Instead of pursuing the alleged criminals, federal prosecutors indicted Bourke. He's currently serving a sentence of a year and a day in federal prison in Colorado. Back to our conversation in a minute.